Hello, my name is Justin Wells. I'm the Executive Director of Envision Learning Partners and a proud member and fan of the Assessment for Learning project. And I'm really excited today to have a conversation with another Assessment for Learning movement member, young Whan Choi. We actually both hail from the San Francisco Bay Area, and we've been talking about assessment for a number of years now. And in the run up to the Assessment for Learning convening, which is happening in Tucson, Arizona, in February 14th through 17th, open for folks to join us there. We're really excited to get that going again after the pandemic, the hiatus of the pandemic. But in the run up to that, we've been kind of telling some stories around Assessment for Learning members and participants and thinking, and decided to be a great opportunity to talk to young Whan, who recently had his book published, Sparks into Fire, Revitalizing Teacher Practice Through Collective Learning. So excited, young Whan, to see this work of yours come out. And I'm going to let young Whan say more about his background in the book here in a moment, but he has been a leader in the performance assessment movement. We were just chatting about this for his entire career, essentially, as a teacher in some of the most respected schools doing this work, including the Met Center and out in the East Coast and Met West out here in the San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland. And in addition to that, he's a podcaster, now an author. So we're just excited to kind of talk about some of the intersection between the themes happening in young Whan's great book, as well as what we're going to be talking about in the convening in Tucson. So young Whan, first, welcome and thanks so much for making some time for us to do this today.
Yeah, Justin, it's really great to be here. I always enjoy our conversations, so getting to do this with our ALP community is really exciting, and then also just really doubly exciting for me to be able to talk about this book and to draw some connections to the assessment for learning work, which deeply is connected. Because assessment practices have been deeply a part of everything I've been doing as an educator, whether it was in the classroom or working with teachers. So it infuses so much of what's in the book. And I guess I'll just say by way of introduction, something that was always very motivating to me as an educator and why I came into this profession has a lot to do with my own personal identity. And I write about this in the book in the first chapter around purpose. And that purpose is such an important part of what brings us into education. And for me, a big part of my purpose was about really helping students who have experienced marginalization in school to feel really centered in their learning, to really feel really centered in who they are culturally, in terms of their family, in terms of their community. And to be in school spaces that really honor and respect that. And that comes from, not having had that as a student myself, as one of the few Asian American students throughout my K-12 experience and even in preschool. And there's a photo actually that leads this book, which is
I know I love that you have that photo in there. It's powerful.
It's just a picture of me there. And I'm the only Asian student in the class. And I'm literally standing at the margin of the classroom. And I look at that photo and it just reminds me so much of what school is like for me and why I was so disaffected and upset and not feeling comfortable in my own skin for so much of my childhood and upbringing. And that's an experience that I would not want any student to have. And unfortunately, I think too many of our students, particularly those who experience racial marginalization and other forms of marginalization in school, whether it's because of their gender identity or sexual orientation or class background or special needs designations, like students experience that kind of marginalization every day in our schools. And it's my call to action in terms of why I became an educator. And I think performance assessment systems are an incredibly important piece to addressing this And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just did want to say that about, who I am and like why I'm in this work. And I think all of us have stories, all of us have important stories that we need to tell as educators. And we also need to listen and create space for educators to tell stories. So I'm really honored to also have the chance today to share some more of those stories. And there's a lot of stories in this book.
Yes.
And I'll say like that is like I describe it kind of as the lifeblood of this book is stories, because as much as this is a book about like how to lead professional development, I didn't want it to feel like a manual. I wanted it to be animated. I wanted to feel alive for people, and the way that books feel alive to me is through the act of storytelling. So much of this book, which has 7 principles of professional development. And those principles are around centering our purpose, around active learning, around learning from students. It's leading and learning from teachers, collectivism, vulnerability, and empathy. And so, in those 7 chapters, each reflecting one of these principles, I tell a lot of stories to try to really illuminate what does this look like in practice, in addition to giving the reader, some real hands-on tools to use.
Young Wai, that's actually something I wanted to. It's a nice blend into the fact that you're much of the book. It draws from all parts of your career, but a lot of it has to do with your work in Oakland Unified School District. You had the title. And I love this. I've always kind of loved this and wanted to chat with you about this. You had the title of Manager of Performance Assessments. And I mean, for those of us in the assessment for learning community and movement, I mean, it's just like, wow, here's a district, here's the thoughtful educator where the title is announcing a kind of focus on something that clearly the district and you feel is important. And much of your book is around some of the great work you did with the teachers. I mean, it's such a great way that how are we working with teachers to help create these great experiences for students. But I would just, and I know this is going to give you an opportunity to tell some more of those stories from your book, but what did you do in that role? Tell us a little bit more about like what that role entailed, and what is the significance of a school district kind of prioritizing not just assessment generically, but performance assessment?
Yeah, you may have said this a little bit offline, but or maybe you said it right at the beginning of this, but you mentioned of us being in a movement. And one of the things about being a movement is that so much of it is inspired and animated by the individuals who are in that movement, and it doesn't always come from the leader at the top of the org chart, but leadership can emerge from many different spaces. And I was really lucky, when I started in OUSD in a central office role, it was through a grant. And the grant was a 3-year grant intended to support civic engagement. And this is a story I tell actually in the chapter that you were mentioning about teacher leadership. Because when I went to the teachers, and one of the things we had hoped in the grant, it's actually written to the grant proposal, was build civic action into the senior project. Right. And it sounds great on paper. And so we went to all the high schools and the teachers who teach the senior projects. And I literally asked them, like, what do you think of this idea? And what's been your experience with the senior project? And across the board, there was so much negative feeling towards the senior project. Everybody was already so overwhelmed. They didn't want to do it. One person described it as like the hot potato at their school. Nobody wanted it. And I thought to myself, we're going to add more to this project. Like, I know it says this in the grant, but like, we can't do this. Like, there's not a way. When you really take the time to listen to what teachers need, what they needed and what they expressed to me was that they needed a space to collaborate. They needed a space to, come to some common understandings of what the senior project would be. They wanted professional development support. And so I went back to the funders and I went back to our program leads and I said, like, hey, we can't do this. Like, I know this was in our grant proposal, but if we go forward, we're going to fail. Like, the teachers, there's no appetite for this here. So we were able to advocate because of what we heard from the teachers, because we listened to them, and we wanted to lead with them. And we used their needs to drive and animate the things that we were trying to do next. And so rather than trying to push the civic action component, we stepped back and said, okay, well, let's provide what you all are saying you need. And so my title actually came about in part because I was already doing the work. And so when the grant money disappeared, I went to the district and I said, hey, can I get a job? Because I'm out of money, and they were like, well, you're doing this really important work. We see its value, because the teachers are talking about how important it was, and they were really excited about what we're doing. And so that actually was what led to the title being manager performance assessment, because there was never a position like that before. And so like the work actually led the role rather than the other way around.
Yeah, which is a great story, and I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that you had a major hand in writing that title of that role. But it also, you're absolutely right. It does speak to the fact that teacher leadership, educator leadership, that's not necessarily at the top, is so often the point of origin for some really great things that can emerge in a given learning system. In your case, Oakland Unified, really started to be an observable performance assessment system. You used that term earlier.
Right.
And what I think was I was honored to be able to witness some of this work, just being neighbors to you over the years, and watching how the Oakland Unified Capstone program, became something that was celebrated. You guys are pointing to student work on it. So you have some stories about how transformative learning experiences some of the kids underwent. So Capstone, you moved from that hot potato to, wow, this is some of the deepest work we do, most transformative work for students. And also it's exemplifying kind of, Oakland Unified had a graduate profile. You guys were kind of raising the flag of that profile in this work.
Right.
So I would love for you to just kind of talk some more about, like, assessment for learning project among many different practices, but Capstone, portfolio defense, performance tasks, these are some of the common, practices and structures associated with performance assessment. And in your all's case, it was really making that Capstone feel like something that the students and teachers alike were loving to work on. Talk about that journey some, how you guys got there.
Yeah. And as I said, right, it was this hot potato. It was this thing nobody wanted to hold. And it wasn't because people didn't see its value. They just felt like it was a lot of work that wasn't being supported. And so, one of the things that I lifted up at every Capstone meeting was the data that we gathered in that first year of listening to teachers. And the thing that they told us consistently was, like, we have had no professional development support around the Capstone, even though we have a board policy. Sorry, I'm interchanging senior project and Capstone.
That's fine. Sorry, senior project. Use the phrase that you guys were using.
Yeah, senior project is what we used to call it, and then it evolved to graduate Capstone, in part because of what you were saying, Justin, is like, we didn't want this to feel like this senior year thing that stands on an island by itself.
Right.
But as a capstone, it implies that this is the culmination of not just high school, but of your entire K-12 experience. So the name change was intentional by design, to really try to break down some of the barriers to the support necessary for students to be successful, so that the senior project teacher didn't feel like, oh, this is just my thing that I have to do, and all the burden of it lies on my shoulders, but that the school and the system picks up the weight of it and says, no, this is our guiding and animating, life force that's going to, define the culture of our school and our program. And you can see it, right? Like in schools, like the Envision schools, like a Met West, like a Life Academy, out here in the Bay Area. When you enter a school that's really designed around the performance assessment system, right, there's a different feeling to, how students approach their learning. And so it can't just be this tag on at the end of 4 years. That's not really going to be the thing that's going to transform the learning experience for students. It's got to start, it's got to be at every, stage of the game along the way. And if I can
Yeah.
come back to, I think one of the things that you were asking about, in terms of that journey, the other thing that was really valuable for us was looking at student work, and
Oh,
that
great.
became, one of the, I think, critical pieces for getting our teachers across, and we're talking about 8 or 9 really different high schools, with teachers with all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences coming together into the same space to talk about the senior project. And so, everyone's going to be all over the map. But the thing that always grounded us is when we looked at student work. We would look at oral presentations together, we would look at research papers together, and we began to score those, artifacts and talk about them, and discuss what quality looked like and what we wanted for our students. So the conversations were really focused on what were our students experiencing and what were they able to demonstrate in their learning. And when you center the students, right, which is something I talk about in the book, when you center students in our professional learning spaces by looking at student work, for example, it can really bring people together in a way that takes it from this sort of like abstract argument that you might be having about whether to do performance assessment or not, to like a very concrete, like,
Right.
we're looking at this thing, what do we think about it, and how do we get everybody in our school to produce something that we think is quality, and what do we
That's
mean by
great.
quality. So that really, really helped us in that journey. And I will also mention, because it's something I'm really proud of, is that we stuck with this for 10 years.
Ah,
So I started in 2012 on this project, and I left the district in 2022. And so over those 10 years, countless professional development sessions. Some teachers stuck with us almost through the entire journey. We had people who would come in and come out, but there was often always a core group of teachers who had at least experienced some of, the professional development over the last few years, and so they were able to carry the work from year to year to year. So we never felt like we were starting over.
that's that's powerful to talk about. It's just an important point about the kind of the stick to itiveness of your all's endeavor. The other thing that I loved you talking about the focus on, like, in some ways, like, that was perhaps the most visible um the most visible characteristic of what you guys were up to, was just continuing to focus on looking at student work. I'm reminded of one of the, core principles of the assessment for learning movement. I think you mentioned it even when we were chatting earlier, about systems of assessment being built from the student out rather than the
Mm-hmm.
policy down. In the story you just told, it sounds like you and those teachers, young Whan, were able to take that senior project, felt like kind of a policy down thing at the time, right? Like the hot
Mm-hmm.
potato vibe, but you shifted it to kind of a student out over those 10 years, right? And looking at
Yeah.
student work was one of the key, among the many, but one of the key moves that you talk about in the book, that was key to having this feel like this is built from the student out, not policy down.
Yeah, something else, the way that Assessment for Learning project was talking about student out instead of top down. Um, One way that I would talk about it with our teachers was practice before policy. And a lot of our district leaders, they wanted to do a new policy, like, oh, you're doing this graduate capstone, it looks really great, let's do a new policy. And I was like, well, we're not there yet. We need to build our practice, right? And once we have our practice in place, or when we feel like we have enough practice in place, then the policy makes more sense. And sometimes we lead the other way around, right? Or most often, I think in our systems, our leaders tend to think, well, we got to have a policy, and from the policy we'll develop a practice. But a lot of times, the practice is already on the ground, right? It's like these are the sparks, right? We see these sparks of amazing teacher practice everywhere in our system, and so what are we going to actually cultivate? What are we going to tend to? What are we going to turn into the fire that's really going to transform our system? And, I think that's what it's a different approach to growing and bringing about change within a system, is to look at the existing practice, figure out who the leaders are of the kinds of transformations you want to see happening, and support them to step into those leadership roles, to build to build the culture and community around those things that you want to see happen, right? And in the case of performance assessment, I would venture to say in most systems, there are those teachers who are already doing this kind of, exhibition style learning,
Always.
student demonstrations of learning. They're always there. So how do you begin from that? How do you begin from what's possible and already happening,
right,
and use that as the spark?
That's great. The Young Whan, the driving question for the upcoming convening in Tucson, well, actually just for the assessment for learning year with Tucson as a particular moment in that, is I'll kind of read the question out. What can we learn together about how assessment for learning relates to learner belonging, equity, and liberation? You brought it up at the beginning. You talking about what so motivates your work as an educator has been around having all students feel something that you didn't get to feel. And I would love for you to, based on all the many things you talk about in the book and your experience, it just struck me as such a key theme in Sparks into Fire was this notion, but it's surprising, right? Like we think of assessment as oftentimes like, oh, wow, this is a challenge. I've got to show what I'm capable of.
Right.
Not necessarily seeing it as a moment where you feel the warmth sense of belonging per se, right? Like the connotations might not normally come together.
Right.
And yet in your work, particularly with the Oakland, capstone teachers, there's so much about what you guys were doing, which was exactly about promoting that sense among kids. And I'm just would love for you to talk about what did you guys learn about how assessment can relate to a learner's sense of belonging?
I mean, it's such a good question to pose, this question of belonging, equity, and liberation, and the role of assessment. And, when I was thinking about that, what is belonging but being seen? When you have a sense of being really seen and held by community, that to me is what a sense of belonging is all about. And if everybody is experiencing that, right, even your students who traditionally or outside in the world maybe experience the most sense of not belonging or alienation or marginalization, right, in my case, right, if they can come into a school context and feel seen, right, then that's equity, right, and that's liberation, really. If all those students are being given what they need, they're being seen and they're being given what they need to be successful and to be, to realize who they are in the school space, that is as close to liberation as you can get within a school system, right? There's larger structural issues out in the world that they're going to have to contend with, but in terms of what you can hope to create in a school, right, if you can create a sense of belonging and provide every student with that, no matter who they are and what they come in with, and also provide them with what they need to be who they are, who they are meant to be in the world, like that's liberation. So belonging is foundational to all of that. And a performance assessment system, and to your point, like you think assessment, you're like, oh, test taking or scores and evaluation.
Yeah, it's not the belonging moment, like
right, yeah,
it's happening like before and after or something, right?
Right. And standardized tests actually do the opposite of belonging, right? They compare you against others,
right?
They rank you,
They're sorting you,
they separate you, right? They sort you, right? So standardized tests do the opposite of that. And so we wonder why students don't experience belonging in schools where, the conversations in the staff meetings are about, who's below expectations, or, like who's, at a 3 on the, on the SBAC exam, or who's at a 1, or, the disproportionalities, these are conversations that tend to dominate our staff spaces, which then trickle down to how the adults think about the young people in the classroom. But if you start from the student and you go out from the student, right, like we were talking about before, and this is what we were really doing in Oakland, is we're asking students in the graduate capstone to tell us about the things that make them upset, that make them passionate, that make them feel joy, that make them have an emotional response to their learning, that make them want to dive deep into something. And so when students research about these issues, whether it's, something like deportation because their family members have experienced that, or, they're writing about mental health issues because they see their cousin struggling. They're bringing in their deeply personal interests into their learning. And it seems so natural, right? Like it seems so obvious. Like when you think about anybody who does a dissertation, they don't do it on a topic that
Yeah,
they don't care about,
that's a great analogy.
right? Like why would anybody go do a doctorate and spend 4 years researching, studying, gorillas if they don't care 1 cent about gorillas, right?
Yeah,
You're doing that because you have some deep passion for it, right? So we're giving students that chance to say, like, what am I deeply passionate about? And in the process, they're bringing their full selves to the experience. And then they're presenting it, and then their families are there, and then the adults in the building see them, and then their peers see them, right? And that all creates a sense of belonging.
right.
And it's no wonder that, like, there's tears at these exhibitions of learning, right? Like you've seen this,
Yep.
consistently everywhere you go with these types of performance assessments. They're emotional experiences because students actually get to show up in a way where they're being seen and held by the community, right? So
Yeah.
a performance assessment system and belonging are completely connected, and so important together. And to think about assessment, or to think about how we can create belonging in schools and not talk about the assessment practices is like a fatal flaw for
Yeah.
us. It would be a complete pitfall if we were to try to create a sense of belonging, but don't address the fact that, what we're doing is ranking and sorting students every day.
Like I've witnessed some of the Oakland students, both live and on video, in the when they're presenting, and it is a just there's no question they're having a peak intellectual / academic experience. I mean, the word is so impressive. Like the again, this is about the sort of skills on display.
Yeah.
And they're having a peak and positive emotional experience
Right.
happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
I've always felt like that was the potential power in well-designed performance assessment, is that these things almost like, spikes coming together are kind of happening at the same time.
Mm.
And you never forget it. The students never
Yeah.
going to forget that. And so yeah, I loved how you kind of remind us that something can be challenging, rigorous, deeply intellectual, but the student is, as you put it, feeling seen, and also there's a positive sense of what they've accomplished. I was so taken by your story about your former student DJ.
Mm.
And just a powerful. It represented so many different key concepts you were getting across in your book. I'll maybe let you share the story, but I'm so curious about how his question that really pushed you. How do we think about that as in our movement? We're trying to make assessment better in our country.
Right.
And he asks you this really interesting question, and it's pushed you. Beautifully vulnerably, you kind of describe it in the book, and I just thought it'd be great for our ALPers to kind of hear that story and how it's informed your thinking about assessment.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for bringing DJ into the space. It always, hearing his name and thinking back on our relationship and ongoing relationship always brings a smile to my face, just because he occupies a very special space in my heart. And, he has sparked a lot of learning for me, as much as we as teachers are supposed to be in the role of sparking a fire in our students. DJ was one of the students who really sparked a fire in me. And, we were very close during the time that I taught him. I taught him for 4 years, from 9th grade to 12th grade at the Met Center in Providence. And we shared very similar interests in music, and he was a beautiful poet. And, I love the written word. And so we were always writing back and forth and having conversations about political issues and writing. And um, he went off to college, and we would talk occasionally. And one point, he asked me this question, and he was struggling in college at the time, and he said, why didn't you push me harder? And that was devastating for me, to hear, because I cared so much about him, that hearing that from him really, made me question my practice as an educator, made me question what I've been doing, and if I had been doing enough, or if I had been doing, if I had been doing the right things, because I never questioned my effort. It was like I knew I was working hard, but I didn't know if I was working effectively. And when I later read Zaretta Hammond talking about the notion of being a warm demander, it immediately resonated with me, because, on the one hand, like there was this like warmth that I had, this care that I had for Domingo, or DJ, um, and I was trying to be demanding of him, but I realized that there was something that I wasn't doing, which was being a skillful demander. Because being a demander, there are a lot of tough teachers who like demand a lot, and there's a lot of schools, like no excuses schools, that demand a lot of students, but they don't necessarily do it skillfully. And I realized that the gap wasn't the fact that I wasn't wanting to be, wanting to set high expectations. Is like I actually didn't know how to move students towards those high expectations effectively. And I had to shift and really begin to study the craft of teaching a lot more intensively after my time in Providence, and really look at, like, what does it mean to teach literacy? What does it mean to really get students ready for the demands of college and the demands of post-secondary life? And his question was really sitting there in the back of my mind, that, during the years that I was in the classroom, the 6 years after that, where I was really trying to figure out, like, how do I improve my practice? So I would say, like, a big part of, like, how do we push our students to do better? How do we, when DJ says, like, why didn't you push me harder? It's not that some of us aren't trying to push hard, but we don't necessarily always have the skill. Um, and it's our job as a system to support teachers to have those skills, right? That's the role of professional development. And that's in part why I wrote this book, is because I care so much about the development of our educators. And it's so important that they have the skills to be able to do the work that we need. But I would also say, I wouldn't put the onus all on the shoulders of the teachers, because I feel like we also need to push our systems better, and we have to push our school cultures better. And it's really when you see an entire school culture, and I was alluding to this earlier, but if the entire school culture is centered around pushing students through performance assessments, and there's benchmark assessments at 8th grade, and then at 10th grade, and then at 12th grade, and they build on skills, and there's a culture, and students are watching each other present. And so those 9th graders are watching those seniors, and they're seeing what's expected of them. All of that culture is what pushes students.
Yes.
It's not just one teacher having high expectations or being an amazing educator, which is some kind of mythology that we really like to, drink the Kool-Aid on in our system. Is, it's this one educator who's going to come and be the hero and get the students, to, transform their lives. But it's not like that in practice. In practice, it's an entire community that really comes together to support students. And that's when we really see transformative outcomes.
Beautiful, young Whan. Thank you. I mean, it actually touches on, you brought up the phrase at the start of our conversation about a performance assessment system. And you can have a great performance assessment, but it can feel random unless it's at that level of a system where, and you've touched on a number of things that make that happen. Teachers collaborating. You have a whole chapter on collectivism, looking at student work, having challenges that are not just simply hard, but actually that students want to care about, the way that a PhD cares about
Mhm.
his or her dissertation. I mean, all the different themes that you've brought up today are getting at what it means to kind of bring a performance assessment from an great individual task to something that's happened at that systemic level. So, and I just encourage folks to kind of like see it all kind of put together by, and it's a great read, by the way, Young, beautifully written, the way that
Oh, thank you, Justin.
you weave stories through practical advice around, hey, here's some great like protocols to use when you're doing PD together as a department and stuff like that. And you're actually just reminding me that like that's why I'm really excited that the Assessment for Learning project, our movement, is kind of rebooting after some tough times
Yeah.
through the pandemic. Grateful for those that are kind of getting our convening together again, and other sort of like virtual events, and even just the blog series that's been recently happening. All that stuff's getting these kinds of conversations happening again. So thrilled that you and I could kind of do this publicly for and share it with the rest of our colleagues in the movement, and looking forward to more opportunities like this, and excited just to follow what happens with your great experience and skills next, Young Whan, with this book as a platform for that. Anything else you'd like folks to know about where they can learn more about your work? You've got the
Yeah.
podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Justin. I would, and I've really enjoyed, being in this space with you and all our ALP colleagues, who hopefully will get a chance to listen and join the conversation. A great place to find me is at my website, which is just simply youngwhan.com. So that's YOUNGWHAN.com. And there's links there to the book. And I also just want to shout out, again, all the ALP fam. I think both of us brought our ALP mugs to the conversation from 2021. This is like the last thing we did before
The world shut down.
yeah, before the world shut down. So it's nice to have this memento, and in honor of the next convening. So yeah, please stay in touch, and look forward to hearing from folks. And thanks, Justin, again for the conversation.
It was great. Thanks. And to be continued.